Hi everyone. In this lesson, I'm going to discuss demand forecasting in a supply chain. So, this is the outline of my discussion today. First, I will discuss the role of forecasting in a supply chain. Next, the characteristics of forecast. Thereafter, basic approach to demand forecasting, and finally, forecasting in practice. Now, let's discuss about role of forecasting in a supply chain. Demand forecasts form the basis for all supply chain strategies, and all pull as well as push supply chains use forecasting in the supply chain practices. So all pull processes in a supply chain are performed in anticipation of customer demand, whereas all push processes are performed in response to customer demand. So we discussed about this in lesson number 1, so I'm not going to discuss this in detail in this lesson. So however, for push processes, a manager must plan the level of activity, be it in production, transportation, or any other planned activity. Whereas for pull processes, a manager must plan the level of available capacity and inventory, but not the actual amount of product to be executed. So in both instances, either it's pull or push, the first step a manager must take is to forecast what the customer demand will be. And also we must keep in our mind, when each stage in the supply chain make its own separate forecast, these forecasts are often very different or it's very difficult. So the result is a mismatch between supply and demand. So why we try to do forecast? Because we want to keep a balance or a match between supply and demand. So if the different entities in the supply chain forecast separately, so finally we might ended up with a mismatch between the total supply and the total demand. So when all stages of a supply chain work together to produce a collaborative forecast, it's going to be much more accurate than do individually in different entities. So it's very important to keep all these decisions interrelated. And also I must mention here, as we know, there are different functional areas of an organization. For example, the production, marketing, finance, human resource management. So all these functional areas also involved in forecasting. And when we are making supply chain forecasting, we also should consider the forecasting of these departments. So it's always the interrelation between all these entities and all these functional areas of a supply chain is very important. And if you take some mature products which has stable demand like milk or salt, okay, so the forecasting usually very easier. Whereas if you take some goods like fashion goods, okay, or some high-tech products, okay, so it's very difficult to do forecasting. So we have to identify the type of the product that we're going to deal with and the type of product that we're going to make forecast in the supply chain. Now I'm going to discuss with you why forecasting is important in an organization. So the proper forecasting helps you to ensure that you have enough supply or the enough goods to satisfy your customer demand. Okay, if I take the other two ends, if you overestimate, you will have more stocks in your warehouses, which incur some cost for the organization. And on the other hand, if you underestimate, your demand will be higher than your supply, whereas you ended up with some dissatisfied customers. To avoid this both ends, it's very important for you to identify the exact amount of products that you have to supply to satisfy your customer demand. Now let's talk about the characteristics of forecast. So the companies and supply chain managers should be aware of the following characteristics of forecast. So number one, forecasts are always accurate and should thus include both the expected value of the forecast and a measure of forecast error. So the forecast error, calculating the forecast error or called the demand uncertainty, must be a key input into most supply chain decisions, but unfortunately most firms do not maintain any estimates of forecast error. So as long as we calculate the forecast error accurately, that makes our forecasting more accurate, giving the actual figure of the expected or the future demands of the supply chain. And the next one, long-term forecasts are always less accurate than short-term forecasts. That means long-term forecasts have a larger standard deviation of error relative to the mean that short-term forecasts are. So the forecast horizon is an important factor that we should consider when we are dealing with forecast. And the next one is aggregate forecasts are all usually more accurate than disaggregate forecasts. So as they tend to have a smaller standard deviation of error relative to the mean in the aggregate forecast. So when we are forecasting in aggregate nature, so the forecast value that we get is more accurate than we are forecasting for disaggregate factors. And the next one, in general, the farther up the supply chain a company is, the greater is the distortion of information it receives. So one classic example of this is the bullwhip effect. Okay? So the bullwhip effect means when we are moving more towards the upstream of the supply chain, okay, so we see a huge variation or the variation of demand or the order become larger. Okay? So the order variation is amplified as order move farther up from the end of the customer. So as a result of that, farther up the supply chain as an enterprise is, the larger the forecast error is. So in order to avoid this, the collaborative forecasting based on sales to the end customers is more important when it comes to forecasting dealing with the upstream of the supply chain. Okay. So those are the main key factors of forecast that we have to keep in mind when we are forecasting in the supply chain. So because of these characters of forecast, we cannot 100% say no to forecast, but we have to keep these factors in mind and do forecast in the supply chain. Next, we'll discuss about what are the methods of forecasting. So let me briefly discuss about the different methods available for forecasting, but I'm not going to discuss in detail about these forecasting methods, as you have a separate subject for forecasting in this semester. The first one is the qualitative method. So qualitative forecasting methods are primarily subjective and rely on human judgment. So they are more appropriate when little historical data are available or when experts have market intelligence that may affect the forecast. So it's in that type of nature you can go for qualitative forecasting. And the next one is time series forecasting. So the time series forecasting method uses historical data to make forecasts. So actually the time series forecasts are based on the assumption that farmers' demand history is a good indicator of future demand. So based on that assumption, we do time series forecasting. And the next one is called partial forecasting. So partial forecasting method assume that the demand forecast is highly correlated with some certain factors in the environment, such as the state of the economy, interest rate, etc. So the Partial forecasting method find this correlation between demand and other environmental factors and use estimation of what environmental factors will be affect to forecast the future demand. Like if I take an example, so the product pricing is strongly correlated with demand. So companies can think a partial demand method to determine the impact of price promotion on demand. And the next type of forecasting method is simulation. So simulation forecasting method imitate the customer choice that give rise to demand to arrive at a forecast. So using simulation, a firm can combine time series as well as causal method to answer questions such as what will be the impact of price promotion, what will be the impact of competitor opening a store nearby. Likewise, so we can go for what if analysis by using this forecasting method. So these are the different types of forecasting methods available, and a company may find it difficult to decide which method is more appropriate for their forecasting. So the recommendation is use multiple forecasting methods or create a combined forecast to get more accurate than using one method, because this method carries its own advantages and disadvantages or their own pros and cons. So it's better to have a combination of these methods rather than going for one method. Next, we're going to discuss about forecasting in practical world. So when we are dealing with forecasting in practical world, one of the key main factor that we have to consider is collaborate in building forecast. So collaboration with your supply chain partners can often create much more accurate forecast than you do forecast as an individual event. So it's take an investment of time as well as effort to build the relationship with your partner to begin sharing information between each other, and also create good collaborative forecast which creates effective flow of product in the throughout the supply chain, as also reach the ultimate goal of supply chain management. And the next factor is the value of data depend on where you are in the supply chain. So that means that the value of data depend on where one sits in the supply chain. That means a retailer point of sale data may be quite valuable in measuring the performance of the stores, whereas a manufacturer selling to a distributor, okay, who intends to sell to retailer, does not need all the point of sales details. Okay, so the manufacturer find aggregate demand data to be quite valuable, with marginally more value coming from the detailed point of sales data. So it's very important to identify where you are in the supply chain, and identifying where you sit in the supply chain, you can decide what type of data that you have to use for forecasting purposes. And the next one is be sure to distinguish between demand and sales. Okay? So often many companies make the mistake of looking at historical sales and assuming that this will what the historical demand was. Okay? So this is totally wrong, because to get true demand, adjustments need to be made for unmet demand due to stockouts, competitor actions, pricings, and promotion rates. So these factors also must consider when we are doing the forecasting, and the failure to do so results in forecasts that do not represent the current reality. So we always be sure to distinguish between what is demand and what is sales. Okay? So these are the main factors that we have to consider in dealing with day-to-day forecasting in the supply chain. Thank you very much.